All right, welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Really appreciate you being here with us with Capital City Village. My name is Tommy Ferguson. I'm the Executive Director of Capital City Village. For those of you that may not be as familiar with us, we are a nonprofit focused on helping Austin seniors age well in their own homes for as long as possible. We do that through a mix of programs and engaging activities like this one, as well as supportive volunteer services. So we like to say, stay where you live and live well where you stay. So again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please do stay muted for the first section of our presentation today, and we'll open it up for Q&A afterwards, where you can pop in and ask questions. You can either use the raise your hand function or type some questions in the chat section. We are going to be recording the session, and we will have that available in the events section of our website later this week for those people that may not have been able to be with us this afternoon. We're also attempting to live stream it on Facebook, so if you know some friends, they may be experiencing it that way as well, and it'll be kept on our timeline for the Capital City Village page. So thank you again for being with us. I think we're going to have a great time with this program today. And so just to get us started, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker today. Today we welcome Laura Rice, the managing producer of Texas Standard Radio program. This program is hosted by award-winning journalist David Brown, who has also been a previous speaker with Capital City Village. And it features interviews and reporting that reflect the diversity of the Lone Star State. Texas Standard sets a new bar for broadcast news coverage, offering crisp, up-to-the-moment coverage of politics, lifestyle and culture, the environment, technology and innovation, and business and the economy. But more about Laura Rice. Before joining Texas Standard, Laura worked for just a few cubicles over in the local KUT newsroom, where she served as the station's morning edition producer and fill-in host. Laura found radio after a start in television news. She worked as an anchor, reporter, producer at stations in Austin, Amarillo, Toledo, Ohio. She graduated from journalism school at the University of Missouri-Columbia and earned an MA from the University of Texas at Austin's Department of Radio, Television, and Film. She loves leading special projects for the team, including the National Edward R. Murrow Award-winning documentary, Out of the Blue, 50 Years After the UT Tower Shooting, and The Long Haul, Texas and the Pandemic. So again, thank you, Laura. We are very, very pleased to have you with us today. I'm going to turn it over to you to give your presentation, and then I'll moderate some Q&A afterwards. But again, thank you so much and welcome.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I have to say, I've been excited to do this, but also very nervous. You know, in radio, we are used to being in a small room by ourselves or just one other person, and we don't often see the people that we're talking to. So it's exciting to see you. And also, since the pandemic, I really haven't seen anyone. This is the biggest group I've been involved with in the pandemic, but of course, we're all meeting virtually and very safely. So it's exciting. I thought actually first I would give you a tour of my studio space, because I am at work right now in this strange extra room in my house, which I'm very lucky to have. It was a room that we never used before. It was like we had boxes that we never unpacked, ended up in here, where this black thing here is the bottom of the box springs of a mattress with a sheet on it, because when we had our second child, we didn't have room for the guest bed anymore, so we moved it in here. But what actually worked out is that since I use this as a recording in a studio space, it's actually the box springs is on this wall and the mattress is on this wall, and it turns out that it's actually kind of good for the sound recording here. So it does a natural job of that. I think if you would have told me that we could do radio from home, I never, ever would have believed it. But we have done it for more than a year now, and it has been very successful. I think listeners at home, maybe they hear a little bit of difference. Maybe it's not quite the same studio quality that they heard before, but but we're still doing the same stories. We're doing, as many stories. We're doing it, especially important stories. I think during the pandemic, I've been just especially aware of how important our jobs are, getting out information from doctors and scientists about, the latest of what we've learned about COVID-19. And then also during the winter storm this year, that was another time where radio was really vital. And all of us working from home, we're also dealing with power outages. I was very lucky that we were on kind of an intermittent blackout scheme at my home. So I was able to, charge computers and equipment in between blackouts, but stayed very warm relatively. But we realized again, just how important what we were doing is. And so even though it's been a very exhausting time for a lot of journalists, an exhausting time for everyone, but for journalists whose job it is to really tell the stories about the people who've been most impacted by these really hard times in our lives, it's been hard to sort of share that. And there've been journalists who've been kind of dealing with forms of post-traumatic stress disorder just because of their delving deep into it. It's also been a very rewarding time because again, we sort of are being made aware of just how important what we do is. So from this room, I do my job, which you already heard a little bit about. Sometimes that includes hosting the Texas Standard right here from this room. And so I have to hope that my dogs outside aren't barking, that my toddler isn't trying to knock on the door and bother me with something, that a big, truck isn't driving outside out the window. They've been putting in a water line and it's been very noisy, but thankfully they're down the block a little bit now. So when I fill in for David, I think on Friday, I should figure that out. It hopefully won't be so noisy, but I have my, studio quality microphone here that I can pull in. I won't try to show you. I have a little broadcast board that I can actually connect to the studio right from home. So there is one person from our team who is still going to the office at the UT campus, who is actually still pushing all the buttons to make sure it all works. But my connection box here connects me with him. And through that microphone, I can talk live on the radio, which just, again, would be a little bit mind-boggling to me before. For not live things, I have my little handheld recorder, which normally I would go out into the field and plug a microphone into this and record interviews. Nowadays, we're doing a lot of that with a cord connected to our phones. So I'm able to record straight from the phone onto this recorder and then get that onto my computer. So during the pandemic, we have just been rolling along. That was my tour, and I thought I'd share my screen here with you. And I'm able to sort of cheat a little bit. Let's see, do I have a screen share? It looks like it says disabled screen sharing, but
yeah, I think I can do that real quick.
Okay. Because you suggested I create a slideshow, but I thought I would cheat and just sort of pull up a bunch of tabs on my computer, and hopefully I'm able to navigate through that and show you. I should have asked you before.
Okay, try it now. See if that will work.
Yes, I see it here.
Great, thank you.
No, thank you so much. Okay, here we go. All right, so I think that you can see this picture that I'm sharing now. The funny thing about my pandemic work experience is that I was not yet back from maternity leave when the world shut down. I had my second baby January 2nd So just off of the new year and off of the tax benefit, as everyone likes to remind me. But I was set to go back to work, I think in early April. Now I can't remember, it's so long ago, but I hadn't been back to work since before January when I had my baby. So it's been a little odd for me in its own special way. Again, I really can't complain, because though it's been hard, I have been able to spend all of this time, even as a working mom, with my little ones at home. So, there's silver linings to even some really terrible things. And for me, getting to be there for a lot of his early months has been a silver lining for me, even though, again, also stressful in other ways. So a little bit turning from me to Texas Standard. I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with Texas Standard because we're on KUT, the local NPR station. We're actually on now more than 30 NPR stations all across the state, which is really exciting and also a challenge. Because it's a big state to cover. There's a lot to talk about. And so we don't have any trouble, highlighting news from Austin, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, because we have great NPR station partners there with decent sized newsrooms that help us identify, what's going on in those areas. And they're constantly, reporters are turning out stories and again, kind of identifying other hot topics that we ought to talk about. We get a decent amount, especially just in recent years, from El Paso. The NPR station there, KTEP, didn't previously have a newsroom, but has hired a news director, and she's wonderful. And we get content from her there. Also, the North Texas NPR affiliate, KERA, has a reporter based in El Paso. So we've been getting quite a bit more out of El Paso than we used to. Also, the Rio Grande Valley, which you can see on there, doesn't actually have an operating NPR station that carries Texas Standard, and actually doesn't have an operating NPR station at all anymore. That happened a couple of years ago when I think it was, I don't remember the story, so don't quote me exactly, but the NPR affiliate, the license expired. Whoever owned it sold it to, I believe, the Catholic Diocese. And so that signal is just not operating as an NPR station anymore, which is a challenge, because we like to think that public radio provides a certain public service, and so it's hard that those folks aren't able to at least get a broadcast on air signal down there. Of course, trying to get the message out that we're available through streaming, we're available, through mobile or on a website, but it's hard when you don't have the NPR station there. But we do have reporters based in the Rio Grande Valley through those different affiliates. We also get a decent amount of reporting coming from Marfa Public Radio, which, though small in size, really punches above its weight class, and they've got a great team of reporters that do a lot of reporting. But I think on an everyday basis, when we're thinking about how we cover Texas, we're often thinking about how we cover stories that don't have as much of a reporting presence. In the very recent years, Lubbock, the NPR station there, has upped its newsroom presence, and we get a lot more from them. But we don't hear a lot out of Amarillo, and even the newspaper there, the Amarillo Globe News, has reduced its reporting staff significantly. So we go out of our way to try to, north of Lubbock into the Panhandle, making sure that we're not forgetting that, that's part of Texas and an important part, as we were talking about before our presentation began. Also, East Texas, there's a lot out there, and Tyler and Longview and all of that area that there's not a ton of coverage. And so we go out of our way to try to make sure that we are covering that area. How do we get our stories? A lot of different ways. We're trying to read a lot. keeping our ears open. We have a lot of our reporting staff, which I'll talk about in a little bit, are from Texas and different parts of Texas. And so they're talking to their families and hearing from their families. We used to think, and in the early days of Texas Standard, it was always a little bit of a challenge to say, oh, how are we going to fill an hour-long show? And there's certainly days that we're not quite sure, what we're going to do for this or that segment, or what's going to be available for the next day. But there are no shortage of stories that are Texas Standard stories. On the national level, it's almost impossible not to find a Texas angle for so many different stories. There's either a Texan involved, or Texas plays a very prominent role, considering maybe it's something to do with the oil and gas industry, or it's something to do with the border. Texas is just a big state with a lot of big diverse interests. And so there are a lot of paths that run through Texas. And that was sort of the idea of the Texas Standard to begin with, which if you were able to attend when David Brown spoke, I'm sure he mentioned the idea really was, we love New York, we love Washington, D.C., LA is great, but there's a whole big country in between those two coasts where a lot is going on. And Texas in particular has a really unique perspective. And so the idea was, talking about the news from a Texas perspective. So here's what the show looks like every day. The first time I saw one of these, my mind just kind of exploded a little bit, because I don't think in a circle, I think linearly. But this is the way the Texas Standard show looks in a circle. And it really isn't hard to think about if you think of it just like the face of a clock. So for a full hour, Texas Standard is on the air, and this is how our show is broken down. You as a listener probably don't necessarily notice, maybe sort of passively, every 19 minutes past the hour, Texas Standard is on a break, and that is because all of these affiliates all across the state are relying on us to take a break when we say we're going to take a break, so that they can cut in and tell their local audience what the weather is like, or whether there is a traffic collision to avoid on a certain road, and to remind them that they're listening to the Texas Standard on their particular station, et cetera, et cetera. So when we're planning out the show each day, we're thinking about these different pies. When we originally thought of the show, and we've pretty much stuck to this, the A segment is our top news segment. It's often politics. Right now, it's often the Texas legislature, because of course the state legislature is in session and things are kind of ramping up or ramping down, however you want to think of it that way. Often two different segments in that A segment, so two smaller pies within that bigger one, but sometimes we'll blow it out and have a round table where we're hearing from a couple of different people for, close to 10 or 12 minutes. In the B segment, B is for business often, although that is a pretty squishy segment. We often also talk about education in that segment, other top stories. The bottom of the hour, we have our statewide newscast, the Roundup, which is a place where we can really keep on top of especially breaking news, because it's a more nimble segment than getting the host ready and finding a guest to talk for a full 5 minutes. We're able to get kind of breaking news in there, also cover topics that are important but maybe aren't worth a longer conversation. So updates from across the state there. The C segment, that 5.5 minutes is actually a bit longer than most of our other segments, split in half. So that's often a segment where we put something that we think just needs a little more explaining time. Often that ends up being a science story. Today, the story was about if we go to Mars, how do we treat that space? In Texas, we have a lot of fences. That's sort of what I was thinking about when I was listening to that segment. You drive along, there's so much land, but all of it is owned. So how do we think about it when we go to Mars? So that was an interesting segment. And then the D segment, is one of my personal favorites, because that's really where we get to a lot of arts and culture. We hear a lot from everyday Texans talking about their experiences, or we hear from musicians and artists and authors and different things. And then in the C segment, we're kind of rounding out the show again, coming back to one of the top stories. We also hear from our social media editor there, a segment which I think is often a bit misunderstood. It's our idea is a bit of a modern letters to the editor segment there. So we're getting feedback from listeners about stories that we've talked about in the show. We're not a call-in show, so we're not hearing from listeners constantly, but this is a point where we hear from what listeners think about a certain topic, or often we're breaking news there. Of course, we know former President Donald Trump was often tweeting out policies, and so that was an area where our social media editor was often breaking news, because we were getting very important updates through social media. So from a circle, we'll go back to thinking linearly. This is our show rundown. And so kind of a behind the scenes look here at how we put together the show every day. And so it's broken again, if you can see, probably not very much, but to the side here, this is the A segment. And then each of these blue bars in between break each segment. And so within each line here, many of them have a script, which would be what the producer writes and the host reads in order to conduct an interview. So the producer puts together, reads, does more reading of the article and closer looking and fact checking, so that the host can come in and kind of say, oh, okay, I understand what this story is, can also give the article a look over, but some of them, it's sort of pre-chewed in a way, so that it's ready for the host. And so this is the way this show looks. And again, that timing is very crucial because of that clock that we are running on, and our affiliates across the state are relying on us to take a break when we say we're going to take a break. So we're very timed out to the second in each show. I wanted to talk about, so this is a regular show. I don't know how many regular shows we do. It's not 365, but it's hundreds a year. But we're also able to we try about 4 times a year to do special shows. And these, as was mentioned in my introduction, are some of my favorite things to do. I'm still very proud of Out of the Blue, and I will talk about it to no end with anybody who wants to listen, because this was the first project that I was executive producer on for Texas Standard when I was still pretty new to the team. And it was a very big undertaking, and it involved collecting close to 100 interviews from people who were around, either on campus or in Austin, or otherwise affected by the tower shooting at UT. And we created this map where people can go and click on and listen to each story of, where people were at and what they experienced, people who were very involved in those days' events, and then also people who just happened to be on campus and were impacted in one way or the other, because as we know, an event like that can have really lifelong effects on a person. So that was a really important project, because it felt like a very important archival project. We partnered with the Briscoe Center at UT to really preserve the oral history there. And it also taught me a lot about how not to do something that's 4.5 minutes, in a quick turnaround for the day's show, but is a full hour long and includes, dozens and dozens of voices, and how to organize that and how to make that into something that is a special program and is interesting and engaging to listen to. And much of the credit there goes to David Brown, who did the writing, and to Emily Donahue, who had the original concept for the program and who got it really off the ground. My job was to sort of just ensure that it happened and not mess it up, and keep the train on its tracks. And so that was really I was very proud that it turned out as well as I think it did. More recently, we did a program about Asian Americans in Texas. It's the fastest growing population in Texas. We talk a lot about Latinos in the state because, again, it's a very big population, but we don't talk a ton about Asian Americans. And so that was our goal with this program, that many have been in Texas, since before Texas was a state. Others are more recent immigrants. Even the term Asian American is very broad and includes people from a ton of different countries and a ton of different experiences. And so, in an hour-long show, we weren't able to cover everyone's experience, but our goal was just to highlight some and to talk about it a little bit. And I was very proud. I bring this one up because we just won a regional Murrow Award for excellence in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we did the story in September, which was, we know the coronavirus pandemic. There's been an increase in hate crimes on Asian Americans during that time, and that was in our minds a little bit. But our goal was to be more positive in this. And then after this aired, we had months after, so certainly not in the immediate wake, but we had the shootings in Atlanta and more reports of Asian hate crimes. And so I was very glad that we had done this and had tried to just highlight some of the voices that are Texas. Another project that we did this year, another one that we just were awarded from the regional Murrows, is Ofrenda. This one is especially exciting for me because we put it together in probably about a month, whereas the oral history about the University of Tower shooting really was more than a year-long effort to get that going. This one, our executive editor brought up at a meeting, Dia de los Muertos is coming up. That's really going to be different this year because, as I mentioned, Texas has a big Latino population. So that's really going to affect a lot of people. And we know that Latinos were especially impacted by the pandemic. And that idea just really weighed on our hearts, and we thought, wow, we should talk about that. We should do something through that lens. And that's how we came up with Ofrenda. And we were just very motivated to very quickly kind of think very hard about a special way to talk about the impact of COVID-19, especially, on everyone, but especially on the Latino and the Hispanic population in Texas. And then another one, because I just am so proud of these projects because they involve the whole team and they really are special to me. We did an anniversary project about the pandemic. And this came out in March, and I think it was hard to do a story about the pandemic when all we had been talking about was the pandemic for a whole year. But we wanted to do with this special a little bit what we did with the Tower shooting special, but instead of looking back 50 years later, we wanted to say, okay, it's been a year. What are we thinking now? And this really, I think, is going to be an important oral history in its own way. And maybe we don't even appreciate it right now because we're also sick of the pandemic and nobody wants to talk about it. And I don't even know if anybody wants to listen to this program right now, but it's an important piece of history. And it makes me think of that role that you hear about sometimes about journalists writing the first draft of history. I don't necessarily feel that every day, but I felt that with this. And I was actually very impressed with our team, specifically with our digital reporter producer Caroline Covington and our host David Brown for kind of making this actually a very optimistic show and a very human and empowering show, because even though it's such a tough topic and there is a lot of devastation in here, we looked at the pandemic through the idea of the hierarchy of needs and kind of the human condition, and there's a lot to feel good about with that, and I do think the listening experience is rather cathartic because it sort of takes you through, kind of our darkest, where we started, where we weren't even feeling like we were going to be guaranteed something like a food source. We were worried about, getting groceries. We were worried about, having toilet paper. We were worried about those basic needs. And then we, had the strain on personal relationships. And then we moved through to, finding some of those silver linings, and then also in some cases, rediscovering or finding something new about ourselves. So that was a very special one to me. How we've been interacting with listeners and with audiences in the pandemic, I mentioned a lot of phone interviews. This was another project that I was pretty excited about. It's tracking the vaccine rollout in Texas. And what we did here was I worked with Matt Largy with the KUT Newsroom to put together a form so that listeners could just record straight from their computer or for their iPhones their experiences trying to obtain the COVID-19 vaccine, because again, May 19th, looking back, that's super easy to get a COVID-19 vaccine, but March 19th, it was not super easy. And there were so many people who were very frustrated. And so this was one way that we tried to connect with people. And we got a lot of stories from a lot of different people. And this grid began kind of small and sort of expanded out. And as the weeks went on, we heard from, I was sort of able to identify through these stories, those people that for weeks were telling me they weren't getting through are suddenly getting through. And so it was a kind of a microcosm of what was happening all across Texas. And now, these people that were waiting have now been vaccinated. And then, the pool of eligibility was expanding again. And then I was noticing trends in different things, people were feeling guilty for getting vaccinated because they wondered if they were, getting it before someone who was really in need. And we were saying, no, at this point, we've heard from the people who are really in need. They've been vaccinated. Go through. It's your turn, So, so this was a cool project for me. I do think that there's a challenge in this, and there's a challenge in the way that I was collecting those voices, which reflects the challenge that we had with people signing up for vaccines in the first place. If it's not super safe for me to go out and find vulnerable people, and vulnerable people are having a hard time, using the technology to even find this tool because they're having the same trouble with, using the internet or using their device in order to sign up for a vaccine. That's hard. That doesn't reach everyone. So I'm very glad that we are moving much closer to a point where, me going out and interacting with the public in a more organic way is possible, because having to rely on technology as a mediator definitely excludes a big part of the population who is especially important to hear from right now during the pandemic. So it was a welcome workaround, but it's a workaround that had flaws, for sure. Because hearing from regular people is really one of the favorite parts of my job. Telling their stories, listening to them talk about either, kind of everyday things or special things that they're proud of. These are sounds of Texas, and you hear these a lot on KUT and on Texas Standard. We're able to give them even a little bit more room. It really is just Texans from, every walk of life, sometimes talking about a book that they've published or, a film that they have produced. But sometimes just talking about something that seems rather mundane. We have a whole series about Texans and their boots, or we had Texans telling us about their masks, during the part of the pandemic when all of that was required. So I like that. I like being able to hear from, quote, regular Texans, not just the officials, and not just the people who sort of make the headlines, because I think this is an important part of our jobs. So what's a Texas Standard story? Like I said, almost anything is a Texas Standard story. We have no trouble these days finding them. I feel like we do a lot of politics right now. It's been criminal justice, these stories about police turnover. That was a good one from yesterday. The story about a bill in the legislature that would define what is and what can and cannot be called meat was an interesting one. So a lot of different things, education. But the great news is that it's not my job to decide every time what a Texas Standard story is. We have a whole team of people who, many of them who have been here for more than a few years now, who every day come to the table, the virtual table now, with ideas about what they're seeing in the news and what they have questions about. And there are a lot of different things that can be a Texas Standard story. And I feel like we almost never say no to an idea. Sometimes we just say, oh, let's focus that, or let's break that out into 5 different stories because that's such a big idea. There are a lot of different things, and everybody's job is to do a lot of different jobs. And so we're all reporting and we're all producing, we're all writing for the web. And it's a terrific team to be a part of. I feel very privileged. So I guess that was what I was mostly going to talk about. I know early on in this, there were some questions about, different restrictions or different challenges that we face. I hope I've addressed some of those, but I'm absolutely happy to answer any questions that any of you guys have as well.
Wow, thank you so much, Laura. That was a lot of information, and really appreciate you going through it. It was nice to get the tour, not only of your in-home studio, but also of all the big highlights that you have available on your website, highlighting programs that you've done. So I just want to scan really quickly. If anyone has a question, you can either type it in the chat section. You can use the raise hand function, which is under reactions on Zoom. So I'll just kind of scan through. If you do have a question, go ahead and let us know. It looks like we do have a note from Ellen. I could listen WF Strong all day, every day. That's great, Ellen. Good to hear it.
Ellen, did you know that we have a podcast where you can listen to WF Strong all day, every day, if you want to? Yeah, we were talking about, this actually reminds me of a programming conversation that we were talking about. And you guys are obviously all very tech savvy because you're using Zoom and figuring out all of this. But we were talking about an interesting community engagement project might be to invite folks to ask us questions about how to listen to and subscribe to podcasts, because in talking with my parents, they don't even understand the idea or the concept. Is that something that you guys are interested in or aware of, or not so much? Yeah, Ellen's interested.
I'm seeing some thumbs up here, and it's something we, we talk about here and there about how to develop different types of programs than we've done in the past, and also I'm particularly interested in figuring out some opportunity to record some of the stories from our village, because there's a lot of great folks in our organization that have such a rich history and background. I want to go ahead and let other folks have the chance to chime in. So if you do have a question, again, either use the raise hand function, wave, I'm scanning the crowd now, or type something in the chat if you'd like, oh, Sue, go ahead, Sue.
Yes, I was listening to your, very positive, cheery reporting of all of this, Laura. And I know that, so much is going on in politics that we hear day after day, or shootings, or, you have it. And I know sometimes I have the privilege of just turning things off if I feel like I've heard enough. What do you do to stay positive and perhaps neutral when you're listening to these things?
Well, that's a good question. Again, I'll lean back on that idea of the trying to be a helper. I think that's one thing that we do try to focus on. I think I also like to distract myself with some fun stories sometimes, finding those passion projects, just digging into, the kid that's doing something interesting, or the, just the regular, like I said, those regular Texans stories. Often the way that I find those is I sort of cheat, and a listener will write in and say, have a comment about some other segment, and I'll kind of write back and I'll say, oh, what's going on in your life? What are you doing? And I sort of use them to help me cheat. I do think I'm sort of a naturally optimistic and positive person. One wonderful thing, about this pandemic has been that we have had fewer of the shooting type stories, although they have cropped back up again a little bit with reopenings. I have to say my daughter is going to public school pre-K in the fall for the first time, and the possibility of a school shooting, and I don't want to think about the actual statistics of it, but that weighs on me very much personally as a parent, thinking about just even the tiniest of risks. And a flash went through my head the other day, we need to get my daughter a backpack. And I thought, do I need to get a bulletproof? Should I think about that? And I talked myself out of it, because apparently they're not even effective and they don't carry their backpacks all the time. But it's definitely, it's very real. But I think I do feel it almost as much as a person as I do as a journalist. In some ways, when I'm on the job, I'm feeling separate, feeling like I'm a translator a little bit. So I'm not necessarily allowing all of the hurt in. But I do appreciate that you see that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for that question, Sue. And Laura, I think we also have now a question or a comment from Tom McHorse. He had raised his hands. If you want to go ahead, Tom.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. Of course, I'm a little addicted to your program, so that makes it even more fun. This question really is partly as a Texas Standard reporter, but partly a little more general. How you decide on priorities, and I would illustrate it with, for instance, AISD comes out with some policy, and there's always going to be at least one person against it. But how do you decide whether it's worth featuring the dissenter, who may be 1 or maybe 50% of the group? But I've always, to be honest, have said, why in the world are they featuring this person who represents such a small percentage of the overall population? Does my question make some sense?
Yes, and I'm sorry, I don't know if it's my rural computer connection, but you broke up a little. I think it is, because some of you are frozen, but I think I understood that. Yeah.
Now you're breaking up.
I'm back. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
I
Sorry.
didn't hate Tom's question so much that I just left. I think my internet is starting to poop out on me a bit here, but I think I understood it. Yes, the idea kind of the false equivalency of both sides of the story, I think was the question. And I think that that's very true. And it's something we've been thinking about even more so in the idea of, vaccine hesitancy, really relying on the science. The other example that I think we lean to a lot is, the different way that we cover climate change now than we did in years past. It used to be sort of a, oh, this is happening, oh, this isn't happening. But when it's, 99.9% of scientists saying it is happening and one not saying it, then we need to be a little bit more, cognizant of that and how we weigh it. With the issue of the example of something from Austin ISD, I think that's a good question, and I think it really is sort of a case by case issue. I mean, the truth is that we want to be very sensitive and open to the idea of somebody who has a real opposition to an issue, but at the same time not feed into misinformation. So I think that's the fine line is whether whether an opposition or whether a particular side is presenting something that is based in fact and in reality, which I know are words that don't necessarily have the same concreteness that they had in previous years, but I still do believe that there are things that are real and things that are unreal. In many cases, at least. So I think we try to at least sort it out in that way. An opinion about an idea is always valid, but if it's based on misinformation, then that's where I think things can kind of go off the rails, if that makes sense.
We again appreciate your show so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your question, Tom. And Laura, this is Tommy. I'd like to check in with a question somewhat specifically about the program that you had Out of the Blue. And then also, I guess specifically about that, but about programs in general, if you encounter situations where you have you've done all this great research, you've interviewed all the people that you could get a hold of, you air the program, and then you hear from people that you might have missed, or maybe something that you could have delved into a little bit more deeply. And I asked the question specifically about that program because I know that there are a lot of folks on this call today or on this program that remember that well. They were in Austin and remember that happening. And in fact, one of the people on this program today, and I'm not sure if he's able to chime in, but Rick was actually on campus the day that it happened. So I just wondered, what is that? You try to leave every no stone unturned and so forth, but how do you deal with that, especially for a really thoroughly researched program, one of those special programs?
Oh, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, it was certainly, we interviewed almost 100 people, but we know there were many more than that, even on campus, that day. So,
I can comment if you want me to.
Yeah.
That's Rick. Go ahead.
I was in a mechanical engineering class that summer and was looking out the windows I was prone to do. And the engineering building was right across the little courtyard from the ROTC building. And I saw these people running around, ducking behind bushes, and I figured they were just having some type of a military maneuver. And when class was finally out, I was in Taylor Hall. They wouldn't let us leave the building. They said they had shooters on the roof shooting at a sniper on the tower. So we waited an hour. I went home, turned on the TV, and there was Whitman's picture. And not only was it his picture, but he was supposed to be sitting in the seat right in front of me in that class. And I had studied with the guy before. He could have just come to our class and mowed us down instead.
Wow. Rick, that is, I do wish we had talked to you for that special. I wish we had that story. And I think, I don't know how the Briscoe Center, we kind of passed everything we had onto them. And I don't know if they're treating it as kind of a living archive, and they're still collecting stories. Cause I would love to have you tell that
Yeah.
story.
I went to the 50th anniversary event at the tower and was interviewed by one of the TV stations. I don't remember which one, but I knew one of the guys that was shot, who died 40 years later, and it was attributed
Oh,
to the
yeah.
gunshot wounds, and his name was added to the list, David Gunby.
Well, and when you were speaking, it reminded me of kind of the other half of Tommy's question, which is like, it was impossible to even, we collected all of the stories, and, of course, a program that, because it wasn't even a full hour, because we had those breaks and there's a newscast in between. So it's, 45 minutes or something, maybe a little bit longer. There was so much that we wanted to include in that program part that we couldn't. And one of the scenes that always struck me that didn't really make it into the final program as much as I would have liked was just the different the ways that people remember hearing it and what they thought they heard, because nobody thought it was gunshots, because back then, and nobody had heard of a school shooting like that. That wasn't even really in people's idea of what could be happening. So I was hearing, some people said, oh, fireworks, because Schultz's garden was supposed to have some event. And so that people thought it was fireworks, or they thought, oh, they're stacking pallets of Coca-Cola. That's what it sounded like to them, or they're doing construction in a building. It must be that. People had so many different kind of ideas in their heads. And that's kind of part of one of those things that stuck in their memory, is what they originally thought it was, because they didn't think it was gunfire.
Yeah, I was inside the building and I couldn't hear anything. I just saw the people running around ducking behind bushes. And then by the time they let us leave the building, it was over with. So I never actually heard any of the shooting, but then realized who he was and that I had interactions with him.
Well, we should exchange emails afterwards, and I'd love to interview you for this.
Okay.
I'll make a point of connecting you by email after the program. Another question I had, and again, I don't want to take time away from anybody else, but I will just ask really quickly. I am curious. So one of the things that David Brown mentioned when we had him on as a guest was the sort of the time element to putting these things together, and you kind of touched on this as well, but that your hours must be just very chaotic, that you might have information or an option to interview somebody that will come in almost in the 11th hour, and that so frequently you're preparing the program like even minutes ahead and making room for things and moving things around and editing and so forth, and getting, packing it as full as it possibly can be. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. And also, during the pandemic and during quarantine and working from home and having 2 young children, I mean, that work-life balance must have been particularly challenging with a job like that, and something that is so time intensive and time sensitive.
Yeah, well, I can actually answer, both questions are sort of related. When we used to have the luxury of being in the office and having access to, the engineer and the perfect sounding recording studio at all times, we were a little bit more nimble. I think one thing that the pandemic has done, even though we are really operating at full speed, we have to be very thoughtful and just very careful. We're less likely to do a live interview last minute, because there's just so much that can go wrong, because we're relying on individuals, home internet connections. So we're doing a lot of pre-recording the morning of and doing a quick turnaround edit on it to get it through, a final set of, ears, so that it sounds as best as it can, because, in radio, where all we are is relying on sound, a poor connection can really just not get the information across to the audience. So we're really prioritizing trying to get a good solid connection that sounds good and doesn't have a lot of bumbles. And so that means we're doing a lot more pre-recording. We're doing a lot of kind of working with the guest beforehand to say, are you connected to Wi-Fi? Are you holding the phone up to your ear? Are you using headphones? There's a lot of, kind of hoops that we jump through to make that all sound good. But yeah, we have, I think, on a normal day, sometimes we only have about 20% of the show for the next day solid. We know for sure what's going to happen. But during the noon hours when we're thinking about the next day's show, that we have our noon meeting every day. And that's when it starts. Already it's Thursday in my mind because we're thinking about the next day's show. But everybody leaves with an assignment. We try to have no holes for the morning of to say, what are we going to talk about? But as you mentioned, things happen. And, the governor announces that, state agencies aren't going to be able to mandate masks. And it's like, okay, well, we're going to have to pivot. If you announce that in the afternoon, then, well, we've got to figure out who's going to be our guest and how are we going to be able to connect with them? Are we going to have to do it this afternoon, or can we, squeeze them in the morning while we're trying to put together the show? So, and that's thanks to the work of producers, especially Jill Ament, who does a lot of our politics producing, and she has a very deep and diverse Rolodex of kind of people that she knows who are subject experts in lots of different areas, and is the kind of go-to person who isn't afraid to text someone at 10 p.m. Because we need to figure this out. We need to have it guaranteed in the morning. She's like, oh, they're probably awake. And she's trying to get all that done. For me personally, it really has been both wonderful and very exhausting. On one hand, I live actually in Dripping Springs, and so I have a 35 to an hour plus commute every day to work on, back in pre-pandemic times. And so on one hand, I do not miss that commute at all. On the other hand, I do miss that commute a little bit because what I didn't realize until several months into the pandemic was I had time alone in the car. And though I appear alone in this office, I am actually, very much getting messages all the time from coworkers, and husbands and kids do poke their head in this, and I do have to go and do some kind of kid monitoring time in the afternoon, and especially on my way home from work, I used to turn off the news because I would listen to KUT on my way in, get updated on everything. And on the way home, I would be like, all right, I'm newsed out, I'm done. And I would put on an audiobook. And that was such a special time that I didn't realize I would miss so much. So I don't know yet what return to work is going to look like for us. I think UT and KUT are still figuring that out. And they say they're going to be very flexible. But I think that I will like to go in a couple days a week because because of that, because I miss my coworkers, interacting with them face to face is much different than interacting with them over, text or over Zoom, because, reliable internet would save me so much time. There are times when I feel like I spend so much time waiting for something to download. And if I were, at work, this would be done so quickly. And I think that another thing that it seems like we've all realized is that when you work from home, you're always at work. It's harder to sort of find separation and turn it off. And so I find myself, working into the evenings or just checking things more instead of like letting myself be off and be at home. But again, the time with the kids is really, I love being able to, run in and give them a hug and eat lunch with them, that sort of thing. So, Ellen, you say, I need to go in my car. I do need to go. I haven't listened to an audiobook since the pandemic began.
Yeah, that decompression time between work and home, I'm sure. I miss that a little bit.
I know I
myself,
should
too.
tell my husband this. I don't think he'd appreciate it, but I would say I'm commuting, right?
That's
This is
right.
my commute time.
And you're
Fill that
right. I
back
mean,
in.
we'll see
But I
what,
do get to sleep in more.
good point. Yeah. And we'll see what the new normal actually turns into. So I just want to scan one more time to see if we have any more comments or questions. But I wanted to say, particularly now that I understand what that schedule of program preparation looks like for you, I realized that you devoted your noon hour not to Texas Standard prep for tomorrow, but also, for us. And so I really thank you so much for giving your time to us today and your insights and letting us, pepper you with some questions and comments and hopefully maybe even some ideas for follow-up stories and more opportunities to connect. But this has been just a real pleasure. So thank you so much, Laura. This has been great. Yes, applause.
Oh, it's been so fun for me. Again, I miss people. So this is great.
Well, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
It is. KUT, of course, and Texas Standard are such an asset to our community. So again, just our immense appreciation, and we'd love to have you back sometime, and we'll see what that new normal looks like when you return to work.
I miss hugs a lot. Hugs have been off limits, and I get a lot of kid hugs, but that's you can only have so many of those, and with the sticky fingers and.
That's right. All right. Well, thank you again. And everybody, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your participation, and stay posted for some more great programs coming up. Laura, again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.